The sterile hum of the ICU at Seoul General felt like a death knell as the blue-tinted lights reflected off Hana Park's unnervingly still face. Every breath she took was a victory against the machines beeping beside her, a mechanical rhythm marking the time she had left. Park Min-ho had finally crossed a line from which there was no return. The medical chart at the foot of her bed told a gruesome story. A shattered orbital bone, a collapsed lung, internal hemorrhaging, and a jagged map of cigarette burns that scarred her porcelain skin like a twisted constellation of his malice. As Hana drifted through a fog of painkillers, she was vaguely aware of the terrified tremors in the nurses' voices. They weren't whispering about her injuries. They were whispering about the man who had called the hospital director's private line every 20 minutes, a man whose voice commanded a level of terror that made the city's elite look like children. Hana didn't know that Kang Joon-seok had already issued the blackout order. While she lay broken, 500 of the syndicate's most disciplined soldiers were moving through the city in a silent, armored tide, their movements coordinated through encrypted nodes. High above the neon glow of the Gangnam district, Joon-seok stood in his glass-walled sanctuary, his unreadable eyes fixed on the horizon. The city of Seoul belonged to him, and tonight he would burn its foundations to find the man who had dared to touch what was his. The silence inside room 302 was heavy, thick with the smell of antiseptic and the low, rhythmic thrum of the life support monitors. Hana Park looked smaller than she ever had, her slight frame nearly lost amidst the tangle of translucent tubes and the stark white of the hospital linens. Her breathing was a shallow, artificial cadence, the only sign that she was still tethered to a world that had been so relentlessly unkind to her. Outside the door, the atmosphere in the hallway was even more stifling. Lily Morales adjusted the IV bags on her cart, her hands trembling just enough for the plastic to crinkle loudly in the unnatural quiet. She had worked at Seoul General for a decade, through mass casualty events and gang wars, but she had never felt a chill like this. Every 10 paces, a man stood. They weren't the usual hired security or the tired police officers the hospital was used to. These men were statues in dark, tailored wool, their faces devoid of expression, their eyes scanning the corridor with a predatory precision that made the veteran nurses take the long way around the nurses' station. "Did you see the lobby?" Another nurse, Sarah, whispered as she retreated behind the safety of the desk, her voice barely a breath. "They've blocked the elevators." Dr. Seo tried to ask for their identification, and the one at the front just looked at his watch. He didn't say a word, he just waited. Lily glanced toward room 302. Through the small observation window, she could see the silhouette of a man standing at the foot of Hana's bed. It wasn't the boss, not yet, but his shadow, Choi Min-tae. He didn't look at the monitors or the charts. He looked only at the door, a silent sentry waiting for an order that hadn't been given. The staff had noticed the change the moment the sun went down. The hospital hadn't been invaded so much as it had been absorbed. The regular security guards had been politely, yet firmly, ushered into the break room, and the local precinct's calls were being redirected to a dead line. It was a lockdown of absolute, terrifying efficiency. Lily stepped into the room to check Hana's vitals, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she adjusted the blood pressure cuff, she noticed a small, bruised hand twitching ever so slightly. Hana's quiet eyes remained closed, but her brow furrowed in a flicker of unconscious pain. Lily looked up and caught Min-tae's gaze. For a second, the coldness in the man's eyes flickered with something sharp, not pity, but a lethal, focused recognition of the damage done. "She's stable," Lily whispered, almost instinctively as if she owed the man an account. Min-tae didn't nod. He simply touched his earpiece, his voice a low gravel that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "She's waking up. Inform the chairman." The silence of room 302 was about to end, and with it, the safety of everyone who had ever caused Hana Park to bleed. Kang Joon-seok was not a man prone to sentimentality. In the high-stakes architecture of the Korean underworld, Emotion was a structural weakness that could bring an entire empire toppling down. Yet, as he sat in the back of his darkened sedan, watching the rain streak across the windows of a quiet library cafe, he had to admit that Hana Park had become the one variable he couldn't calculate. It had started exactly 14 months ago. He had been tracking a money laundering lead that led him to a small, ivy-covered bookstore where Hana worked the afternoon shift. He had intended to stay for 5 minutes. He stayed for 3 hours. He watched the way she handled the fragile spines of old books as if they were living things, and the way she smiled at the elderly regulars with a genuine warmth that felt alien to a man who lived in the cold. Soon the habit became a ritual, a secret, silent sanctuary. Once a week, then twice, then daily, the most feared man in the syndicate would have his driver park blocks away so he could sit in the shadows of the cafe across the street. He knew her schedule better than his own. He knew she liked her tea with too much honey, that she hummed when she was shelving the poetry section, and that she always paused to look at the sunset before locking the door. But as the months passed, Joon-seok's keen eyes began to catch the things others missed. He noticed the way she flinched at loud noises. He saw the subtle, practiced way she wore long sleeves even in the sweltering heat of August. He saw the faint, yellowing marks on her neck that no amount of makeup could fully hide. To the rest of the world, she was a quiet, shy girl. To Joon-seok, she was a masterpiece being slowly defaced by a hidden hand. He had lived his life by a code of restrained power, of watching and waiting until the perfect moment to strike. He had told himself that his protection was enough, that by stationing a single, invisible guard in the shadows of her street, he was keeping her safe. He had convinced himself that ownership was a form of distance. But as he stood now in his penthouse, the memory of her broken form in the ICU burned behind his eyes like white phosphorus. He realized that his restraint had been his greatest failure. He had watched her for a year, documenting her life like a scholar, while a monster had been dismantling her piece by piece in the dark. The guilt was a new kind of pain, sharper than any blade he had ever felt. He had spent a year as her shadow, but shadows were useless against the dark. Now, the time for watching was over. If the world wanted a monster, he would show them one that could tear the sun from the sky to keep her warm. The air in the private consultation room was pressurized, a vacuum of tension that Dr. Seo Yuna felt in her very marrow. She had spent 30 years in medicine, but standing across from Kang Joon-seok was like standing at the edge of an active volcano. He didn't pace. He didn't scream. He simply stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the city lights, his hand resting on a manila folder as if it were a weapon. "Tell me everything," Joon-seok said. His voice was a low, velvet rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. Not the summary, the truth. Dr. Seo swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she opened the digital X-ray scans. "The internal damage is extensive, Chairman. It isn't just the recent trauma. The imaging shows a history." She pointed to the glowing white lines on the screen. "Here, the 4th and 5th ribs are fresh fractures, jagged and dangerous, but look closer at the 6th and 7th. There is calloused bone, old breaks that were left to knit on their own without medical attention. This has been happening for years." Joon-seok didn't move, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He stared at the screen, at the ghost-white cage of Hana's chest that had been shattered and rebuilt in secret. "The cigarette burns on her forearms," Dr. Seo continued, her voice failing her for a moment. "They aren't accidental, they are patterned. Circular scars layered over fresh blisters, and the fracture in her left wrist. It's a defensive wound. She was shielding her face when it happened." The sound that followed was small, but it echoed like a gunshot, the sound of Joon-seok's leather glove straining as he clenched his fist. He wasn't looking at the doctor anymore. He was looking at the reality of his own negligence. Every time he had watched her through a window, every time he had admired her resilience from a distance, she had been carrying a skeleton of lead and glass. He had treated her like a porcelain doll to be admired, while Park Min-ho had treated her like a piece of meat to be tenderized. He used her as a canvas, Joon-seok whispered, and for the first time his unreadable eyes flickered with a raw, terrifying heat. It wasn't just anger, it was a total, systematic erasure of his own humanity. The businessman, the strategist who weighed every move for profit and loss, died in that clinical silence. He turned away from the X-rays, his face settling into a mask of such absolute coldness that Dr. Seo instinctively backed away. He pulled out his phone and hit a single speed dial. "Minty," he said, his voice now devoid of any tremor. "The stepfather. Find out where he eats, where he sleeps, and who he pays for his silence. I don't want him arrested. I want the city to become a cage he can't escape. And bring me Detective Lee. I want to see the face of the man who sold her blood for a paycheck." He walked out of the room without a backward glance, the heavy tread of his boots sounding like a funeral march. The businessman was gone. The monster had arrived and he was hungry. The mobilization did not happen with sirens or shouting. It happened with the terrifying, synchronized silence of a precision engine. At exactly 11:00 p.m., the digital pulse of the city seemed to skip a beat. Across a 3-block radius surrounding Seoul General, 500 men moved as a single shadow. They emerged from black sedans, unmarked vans, and the midnight crowds of the surrounding district, their movements governed by a high-frequency encrypted network that rendered the local police frequencies useless. Choi Min-tae stood at the center of the hospital lobby, his thumb hovering over a tablet screen. With a single swipe, he initiated a localized signal jammer that turned every cell phone in the building into a glass brick. In the security room, the monitors flickered for a heartbeat before being replaced by a static loop, while the actual feed was diverted to Joon-seok's private servers. Within 6 minutes, every exit was a dead end. 2 men in charcoal suits stood at every stairwell, 4 guarded every elevator bank. A dozen more occupied the roof, their silhouettes sharp against the moon. The hospital staff froze in the corridors, watching as their familiar workspace was partitioned with surgical efficiency. It was a masterpiece of logistics, an operation, sanctuary that repurposed the architecture of healing into a fortress of war. Delivery trucks were diverted at the perimeter by men wearing high-visibility vests that looked official enough to deter questions, but carried the unmistakable authority of the syndicate. No one was harmed, but no one was given the option to leave. By the 9-minute mark, the human wall was complete. 500 of the most disciplined soldiers in East Asia had created a vacuum of power. Local law enforcement officers who attempted to approach the block were met by federal liaisons in dark suits, syndicate lawyers and high-ranking associates, who presented flawlessly forged paperwork that tied the area in a knot of bureaucratic red tape. High above the silent streets, the hospital glowed like a beacon in the center of a dark sea. The logistics were flawless because the stakes were singular. Joon-seok hadn't just ordered a security detail. He had removed the hospital from the map of the city and placed it within the borders of his own sovereignty. Inside the perimeter, the laws of the state had ceased to exist. As the 10th minute ticked over, Min-tae looked up at the camera in the lobby and gave a curt nod. The fortress was secure. The girl in room 302 was finally in the only place on Earth where Park Min-ho's shadow could never reach her. The world outside could scream, but inside these walls, there was only the cold, absolute peace of Kang Joon-seok's wrath. While the 500-man perimeter held the world at bay, Choi Min-tae moved through the hospital's administrative wing like a ghost through a machine. He wasn't looking for medicine. He was looking for the paper trail that had allowed a monster to remain a citizen. In a secluded office, Min-tae tapped into the encrypted police database using a bypass key that only the syndicate's highest-level hackers possessed. On the glowing screen, the name Hana Park appeared, but the results were a haunting vacuum of information. Every time an emergency room doctor had flagged a suspicious injury over the last 5 years, a finalized report had been filed, and then, like clockwork, it had vanished. Min-T's eyes hardened as he found the digital fingerprints left behind. Every deletion, every redirected file, and every administrative error bore the same badge number, Detective Lee Sang-chul. It was a ledger of betrayal. For every fracture Hana had suffered, there was a corresponding bank deposit or a dismissed gambling debt in Lee's file. The stepfather hadn't just been lucky. He had been paying for a subscription to impunity. Min-T didn't waste time with anger. He converted the data into a weapon. He tracked the most recent closed case, a report from 6 months ago involving a domestic accident that had left Hana with a broken wrist. The file contained a signature from Detective Lee stating the victim was uncooperative. Min-T pulled up the GPS logs for Lee's patrol car that night. The detective hadn't even gone to the house. He had been at a high-stakes baccarat table owned by a rival syndicate. His losses magically cleared the next morning. The paper trail of blood was complete. It wasn't just a series of documents. It was a map of the system that had failed her. Min-T downloaded the entire cache, ensuring that every buried cry for help was now in his possession. He stood up, the light of the monitor reflecting off his cold, efficient features, and keyed his earpiece. "Chairman, I have the link," Min-T reported, his voice cutting through the static. Detective Lee wasn't just hiding the stepfather's tracks, he was selling him the shovels. He's currently at a bar 3 blocks from the precinct, celebrating a successful month. In the silence that followed, Min-T could almost hear the temperature in Joon-seok's office drop. The orders that followed were short and final. The detective who had turned a blind eye to Hana's suffering was about to find out that in Joon-seok's world, silence was the most expensive thing a man could buy. As Min-T exited the office, he signaled to the men in the hallway. The time for gathering evidence was over. Now, they were going to gather the bodies. Park Min-ho adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his reflection in the glass doors of the hospital lobby radiating the very image of a distraught, middle-class professional. He squeezed his eyes shut until they watered, practicing the slight tremble of his lower lip. To the few local news cameras gathered at the edge of the police tape, he was a man devastated by a tragic accident. He spoke into the microphones with a voice that was soft, practiced, and dripping with a counterfeit grief that had served him well for a decade. "We just want her to wake up," Min-ho told a reporter, dabbing at his eyes with a pristine white handkerchief. "Hana has always been fragile, prone to dizzy spells. We've done everything to keep her safe, but accidents happen so quickly." He played the part to perfection, leaning into the archetype of the suburban father whose world had been shattered. He was careful to mention how difficult Hana could be, subtly planting the seeds of her instability to explain away any future questions. Underneath the mask, however, his pulse was steady, cold, and arrogant. He had already called Detective Lee. The reports would be scrubbed, the fall would be documented, and once Hana was discharged, he would ensure she never had the strength to fall again. He felt invincible, protected by the very institution meant to stop him. But as he turned to walk toward the hospital entrance, the air changed. The cameras began to lower, the reporters falling into a confused silence. Min-ho looked up and realized he was no longer facing a standard hospital security detail. Standing between him and the sliding doors was a wall of men in charcoal suits, their faces like carved granite. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply stared through him as if he were already a ghost. "I'm the father," Min-ho said, his voice regaining its practiced edge of authority. "I'm here to see my daughter. Let me through." One of the men, a tall soldier with a jagged scar near his ear, stepped forward. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't explain the lockdown. He simply tilted his head, a gesture of predatory curiosity. Min-ho's bravado wavered. For the first time in years, the respectable mask felt heavy, suffocating. He looked around for the police officers who usually greeted him with a nod and a handshake. But the precinct cars had been pushed back to the outer perimeter, their lights flashing uselessly against a line of black sedans that seemed to swallow the light. Min-ho's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Detective Lee, sent minutes before the jammer went live, read only. Run. The handkerchief in Min-ho's hand suddenly felt damp with real sweat. He looked back at the cameras, but the reporters were being ushered away by men who moved with the lethal grace of professional killers. The stage was gone. The audience was gone. As the lobby doors slid open with a hiss, revealing the dark, silent cavern of the hospital, Park Min-ho realized that he wasn't a grieving father anymore. He was a rat in a maze, and the master of the house had finally come home. The clock on the wall of room 302 ticked with a clinical, unforgiving precision, marking the deepest hours of the night. Outside, an empire stood on guard, but inside, there was only the ghost of a girl and the man who had failed to see her fatting. Kang Joon-seok sat in a hard plastic chair pulled close to the bed, his broad frame casting a long, jagged shadow against the monitors. He had removed his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms built for violence, now resting motionless on his knees. For a year he had looked at her through glass, through rain, and through the safe distance of his own ego. Now, with only the hum of the ventilator for company, he finally looked at her. He traced the blue veins in her hand, so translucent they looked like cracked porcelain, and the dark, ugly swell of the bandages wrapped around her ribs. In the harsh, artificial light, the cruel boss of the Korean syndicate looked remarkably small. "I spent my life learning how to read men," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely carried across the bed. "I could tell a liar by the way he blinked. I could smell fear before a man even opened his mouth. But I looked at you every day, Hana, and I didn't see a single one of these scars." He reached out, his hand hovering inches above hers, hesitant, as if his touch might shatter what little was left of her. His fingers, which had signed death warrants and crushed glass, trembled. "I thought I was protecting you by staying away. I thought my world was the one that would hurt you." A bitter, hollow laugh escaped his chest. "I was so busy watching for my enemies that I didn't see the one sitting at your dinner table." He leaned forward, his forehead nearly touching the guardrail of the bed. The cold, unreadable mask he wore for the city had completely crumbled, leaving behind a man hollowed out by a singular, burning regret. "Wake up," he breathed, the command lacking its usual iron, sounding instead like a plea. "Wake up, and I will give you a world where you never have to flinch again. I will tear down every wall in this city until there is nowhere for a monster to hide. I will be the darkness that keeps you in the light." The monitors beeped steadily, an indifferent heartbeat for a girl who couldn't hear him. Joon-seok didn't move. He remained there, a silent, grieving sentry in the dark, finally understanding that his power meant nothing if it couldn't mend a single broken bone. He wasn't just guarding a patient anymore. He was guarding the only piece of his soul that was still worth saving. And as the midnight moon shifted, he took her hand in his grip terrifyingly gentle, making a silent vow to the girl who had survived the dark alone. He was done watching. Park Min-ho's composure was fraying at the edges, a ragged hem on a cheap suit. The text from Detective Lee had sparked a cold fire of panic in his gut, but his arrogance, the long-cultivated belief that he was the smartest man in any room, pushed him forward. He assumed this security was a temporary bureaucratic hurdle, a misunderstanding he could navigate with a few well-placed words about parental rights and medical emergencies. He straightened his tie, wiped the cold sweat from his upper lip, and marched toward the main entrance of Seoul General. He didn't make it 5 steps past the sliding glass doors. The air in the lobby didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by lead. Min-ho stopped short as a dozen men in charcoal suits adjusted their positions in perfect, silent unison. They didn't reach for weapons. They didn't shout. They simply occupied the space in front of him, forming a living, breathing barrier of black wool and iron will. This was the human wall of the Kang syndicate, a force that didn't move for the law and certainly wouldn't move for a man like him. "I believe there's been a mistake," Min-ho said, his voice cracking, betraying the grieving father persona he had just performed for the cameras. "I'm Park Min-ho. My daughter is in room 302. I have every legal right to be at her side." At the center of the line, Choi Min-tae stepped forward. He didn't look at Min-ho's face. He looked at him as one might look at a stain on a polished floor. "You have no rights here," Min-tae said, his voice a flat, terrifying monotone. "The laws you're used to hiding behind ended at the sidewalk. Within these walls, there is only one authority." Min-ho tried to bluff, his face flushing a deep, mottled purple. "I'll call the police. I know the precinct commander. You can't just—" "The police are busy," Min-tae interrupted, leaning in just enough for Min-ho to see the absolute lack of mercy in his eyes. "And Detective Lee is currently occupied. He won't be taking your calls anymore." The mention of Lee sent a jolt of pure terror through Min-ho's spine. The safety net was gone. He looked past the wall of men, trying to see into the depths of the hospital, but the hallway was a dark throat waiting to swallow him. He realized then that the 500 men weren't there to protect the hospital from the city. They were there to protect Hana from him. One of the guards moved a fraction of an inch closer, the sheer physical presence of the man forcing Min-ho to stumble backward. He was a predator who had spent years cornering a defenseless girl in a suburban house, but now, for the first time in his life, he was the one being hunted. The human wall didn't just block his path, it squeezed the air from his lungs. Min-ho turned to flee, his respectable mask discarded in the dirt, unaware that every exit was already closed and that the chairman was waiting for him in the dark. The basement of Seoul General was a labyrinth of concrete and exposed pipes, a cold, subterranean world where the hum of the hospital's industrial generators drowned out the screams of the city above. In a small, windowless maintenance room, Detective Lee Sang-chul sat zip-tied to a metal chair. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, casting long, rhythmic shadows across his terrified face. His badge, the silver shield he had used as a license to betray the innocent, sat on a nearby work table, looking dull and discarded in the gloom. The heavy steel door groaned open and Kang Joon-seok stepped in. He didn't look like a man who had just spent the night at a bedside. He looked like a god of judgment carved from obsidian. He didn't speak immediately. He simply walked to the table, picked up the badge, and turned it over in his gloved fingers. "I've spent my life dealing with criminals," Lee Joon-seok said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "I understand them. They want power, they want money, they are honest about their greed. But you—" he stepped into the light, his eyes two shards of frozen coal. "You wore this to convince a 22-year-old girl that there was no one left to call. You didn't just take the stepfather's money, you took her hope." "Joon-seok, listen," Lee stammered, his voice cracking as he strained against the plastic ties. I was just managing a difficult situation. Min-ho is a respected man. I didn't think." "That's your mistake," Joon-seok interrupted, his hand moving with a speed that made the detective flinch. He grabbed Lee by the throat, not to choke him, but to force him to look at the folders spread across the table, photos of Hana's old x-rays, the administrative errors, the records of his gambling debts. "You didn't think I was watching. You didn't think she was worth more than your losses at the baccarat table." Joon-seok's grip tightened, his thumb pressing against Lee's pulse point. "For every report you buried, she bled. For every phone call you ignored, a bone was broken. You weren't a detective. You were his accomplice." With a sudden, violent motion, Joon-seok threw the silver badge onto the concrete floor. He raised his heavy boot and crushed it, the metal bending and snapping under his weight until it was nothing more than a jagged scrap of tin. "Your authority is gone, your protection is gone, and tonight your life as a free man ends." Joon-seok leaned down, his face inches from the trembling detectives. "You're going to give me the names of every officer who helped you. You're going to tell me exactly how many times you lied for him. And then I'm going to give you to the prosecutor. But before I do," Joon-seok's voice dropped to a whisper that promised a nightmare, "you're going to pray she wakes up, because if she doesn't, you'll find out exactly what happens to a man who sells a soul in my city." Joon-seok turned and walked toward the door, leaving Lee alone in the humming dark. The badge was in the trash. The law was coming. But first, the monster had one more debt to collect. Park Min-ho had always believed that the world was divided into those who followed the rules and those who, like him, were smart enough to use them as a cloak. But as the black hood was ripped from his head, the suburban logic of his life dissolved into a cold, damp reality. He wasn't in a police station. He wasn't in a lawyer's office. He was in a sprawling, abandoned warehouse on the edge of the harbor, where the only sound was the distant, rhythmic slap of black water against the pilings. He was strapped into a heavy wooden chair in the center of a vast, empty floor. A single industrial bulb flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow light on the men standing in the periphery, the same silent, stone-faced soldiers who had guarded the hospital. They didn't look like men who cared about his accounting firm, his clean credit score, or the respectable neighbors who thought he was a saint. Here, his suburban status was a currency that had been devalued to zero. The heavy tread of Italian leather echoed across the concrete. Kang Joon-seok emerged from the darkness, removing his gloves finger by finger with a terrifying, rhythmic deliberation. He didn't look angry. He looked like a scientist preparing to dissect a particularly loathsome specimen. "You look confused, Min-ho," Joon-seok said, his voice smooth and cold as polished marble. "You're waiting for the police. You're waiting for the detective to walk through that door and tell everyone this was a misunderstanding. You're waiting for the world to work the way it always has for you." Min-ho tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. I have rights. You can't do this. I'm a citizen." Joon-seok let out a soft, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He leaned down, his shadow swallowing Min-ho whole. A citizen. A citizen doesn't use a lit cigarette to mark the skin of a child. A citizen doesn't break a girl's ribs and then sit down to eat dinner while she bleeds in her room. Joon-seok's hand shot out, gripping Min-ho's jaw with a force that made the bone creak. "You aren't a citizen tonight. You're an animal that's been caught in the wrong territory." Joon-seok signaled to the shadows. Choi Min-tae stepped forward, carrying a heavy metal case. When he opened it, the light reflected off a series of surgical tools and a stack of printed medical photos. Hana's injuries, enlarged and gruesome. "Hana lived in a cage you built for her," Joon-seok whispered, his eyes burning with a lethal, focused clarity. "She learned to be quiet. She learned to hide. Tonight I'm going to teach you those same lessons. We're going to stay here until you understand every single ounce of pain she felt. And when we're done, you'll realize that your respectability was just a mask for a coward. And I hate cowards." Min-ho's scream was muffled by the vastness of the warehouse as Joon-seok picked up the first photo. The predator had finally met the apex, and for the first time in his life, Park Min-ho was the one who was truly helpless. The warehouse was a cathedral of shadows, lit only by the cold glare of a single lamp reflecting off a stack of crisp, white paper. Park Min-ho no longer looked like a man of suburban respectability. His glasses were gone, his expensive shirt was translucent with sweat, and his hands shook so violently that he could barely grip the pen Choi Min-tae had forced between his fingers. He looked at the 17 pages before him, a meticulous, chronological ledger of a decade of cruelty, and felt the walls of his world finally collapse. Kang Joon-seok stood just outside the circle of light, a silent, judging specter. He didn't have to raise a hand. The extra-legal pressure had already done its work. Over the last 4 hours, Min-ho had watched as his life was dismantled in real time on a tablet screen. He had seen his offshore accounts drained to zero. He had seen the anonymous emails sent to his firm's partners, containing evidence of embezzlements he thought were buried forever. He had watched a live stream of his respectable home being stripped of every asset by men who moved like shadows. Joon-seok hadn't just captured him. He had erased the very ground Min-ho stood on. "Sign," Joon-seok commanded. The word was a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. "Every date, every room, every time you made her wish she was dead." Min-ho looked up, his eyes wide and hollowed by a primal psychological terror. If I sign this, I'll spend the rest of my life in prison. If you don't sign it, Joon-seok replied, stepping into the light, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the air turn to ice, you will never leave this warehouse. And I promise you the prison cells in this country are far more merciful than the things my men can do in the dark. In prison, you are a number. Here, you are a canvas, just like she was. The realization hit Min-ho with the weight of a physical blow. The law was his only sanctuary now. He realized that the cruel mafia boss wasn't trying to keep him away from the police. He was forcing him to beg for them. The psychological collapse was total. With a sob of pure, cowardly desperation, Min-ho began to write. He detailed the accidents, the buried reports, and the names of every person he had paid to look the other way. He confessed to things the police hadn't even suspected, his pen flying across the pages as he traded his freedom for the slim hope of surviving the night. When the final signature was dried, Joon-seok took the stack of papers. He didn't look at the man groveling in the chair. He looked at the confession as if it were a holy relic, the only thing that could begin to pay for Hana's blood. He handed the documents to Min-tae, who was already on the phone with prosecutor Rachel Kim. The trap was shut. The respectable Park Min-ho was dead. Only the monster remained, and the world was finally going to see him for exactly what he was. The dawn began to bleed through the blinds of room 302, painting the sterile walls in soft, bruised hues of gold and lavender. The heavy, oppressive tension that had gripped the hospital for 48 hours seemed to lift with the rising sun. Outside, the phantom army was retreating. The 500 men who had stood like a wall of iron vanished back into the city's veins as silently as they had arrived. No sirens marked their departure, and no fingerprints were left behind. To the rest of Seoul, it would be remembered as a strange, bureaucratic anomaly. To Hana, it was the beginning of the first day she would ever truly own. Inside the room, the mechanical wheeze of the ventilator had been replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of natural breath. Kang Joon-seok was still there, though he had moved to the window, watching the last of the black sedans disappear into the morning traffic. He looked weary, the sharp edges of his tailored suit softened by the morning light, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon until he heard it, a soft, dry rasp of a sound that made his entire world stop. Hana's eyes fluttered, her dark lashes casting long shadows against her pale, bruised cheeks. When they finally opened, they were clouded with confusion and the lingering haze of trauma, but as they swept the room, they landed on the man standing by the glass. She didn't flinch. For the first time in her life, she looked at a man and didn't see a threat. She saw the shadow that had kept the monsters at bay while she slept. "You're safe," Joon-seok said, his voice a low, rough murmur that carried an uncharacteristic warmth. He didn't approach her too quickly. He gave her the space he had denied her for so long. "He's gone, Hana. He's never coming back. The gates are locked and I hold the keys." Hana didn't speak. She didn't have the strength yet, but she reached out a trembling hand, her fingers grazing the air between them. Joon-seok stepped forward and let her small, fragile hand rest against his palm. The weight of it was a coronation. He was no longer just a boss or a predator. He was a guardian. The 500 men were gone, but the invisible shield they represented would remain wrapped around her life forever. He had spent his life building an empire of fear. But as Hana's fingers closed weakly around his, he realized that the only territory worth holding was the peace he had bought for her. The transformation was complete. The cruel boss had found his soul in the wreckage of her pain, and as the sun fully broke over the city, the silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was free.